Now, run you through 2 or 3 steps in an exercise to practice building criteria statements. Criteria are harder to write than you might think. A criterion has to give some kind of very clear notion of what is to be measured, among whom, and in what kind of standard. We started off with the observation that a criterion is a standard. You think of any ways in which a criterion is different from a standard, or in what ways is it more specific kind of thing than a standard? Are those words just interchangeable?
The standard exists regardless of what is being measured up against it. And the criterion includes what is being measured.
That's probably a lot clearer to you than it is. It's a hard thing to spell out, but you're on the right way. Hard thing to spell out into words. That's one of the things we're going to try to put on paper right now. We've just illustrated why it's hard. Put it this way, the criterion is a real focus on the achievement or non-achievement of the standard. The criterion statement has within it the notion of what is not meeting the standard. For example, in effect, unworthy, as was in the scripture passage we used, is more like a criterion statement, because it's focused on them not meeting the standard. Now, if I want a group of students to learn something, let's say I have a spelling list, and I want my 3rd graders to learn their spelling words. Over the course of 2 weeks, I'm going to be testing them on, well, make it easy. I typically wouldn't do this in the 2nd grade, but let's say 100 spelling words. We wouldn't use that many in the 2nd grade, but let's say we do 100 spelling words in 2 weeks. What is my criterion? I haven't said, but build me one. The standard is they can spell all these words correctly. That's the standard. Okay. Now, what's the criterion going to be? Be realistic.
50%. Students will be able to spell 50% of the assigned words.
Okay, the criterion could be that at the end of 2 weeks, all the students will be able to spell 50% or more of these words correctly. That's what you're saying. So all over against a percentage. All students would have 50% or more of the words. Okay? Now, some people will come along and say, well, that kind of immediately concedes that you're really not getting people to learn them all. You're just trying to make sure that everybody can learn half. Give me a criterion that puts this emphasis on learning all of them.
A certain percentage, 80% will
No,
learn.
this is not a certain given example.
So
80%.
80% of the students will be able to spell correctly all.
See, what he did was to put the, I know they aren't going to all achieve criterion, put it on the other end of the balance there. Just like you said, I know everybody's not going to be able to do it all, but they all ought to be able to do 50%. But I might also want to look at it this way, that at least 50% of them would do all of them, or 80% as you said would do all of them. Quite typically, a good criterion for a quantifiable learning outcome for a group should be worded in such a way that you're talking about how many people proportional to the whole, 80% of the people, 60% of the people, are going to fulfill how much, what percentage of your intended outcomes or your objectives? Or if you please, do the spelling rules correctly. One of the most common formulas that's used just as a kind of a starting place is 80%, 80%. You understand 80%, 80%? What am I saying? Put it in words. 80% of the students will be able to perform 80% of the intended objectives. That's an 80-80 statement. That's not an unusual way to think about educational outcomes realistically. And I can tell you this, that when you do evaluative studies, if you don't face at the front end some kind of a realistic notion of your objectives, then you're forever and always fudging and messing around and rechanging your objectives, and rechanging your criteria in order to face up to a reality. Can anyone think of something that's happened in the mission world? So it illustrates, I think, something that we do tend to walk ourselves into when we're spelling out objectives and when we're stating criteria and so forth. We tend to get starry-eyed rather than realistic. And a good evaluator holds people to the fire and says, I don't think we're going to want to do that. I don't think we're going to want to write it that way. I think we're going to be a bit more realistic. Now, that's not to say that you ought not to shoot high, but when you're setting up an evaluative criterion, you're really setting up something that says if we don't achieve it, we will have failed. And that's not exactly a comfortable thing, especially when you've done it to yourself. All right, now, we're going to evangelize the city of Toledo, which has 500,000 people. Now, we're going to wage a really important evangelism campaign. We're going to do door-to-door evangelism. We're going to organize every church in town. We're going to bring in people from other places. When we get all this thing done, it's going to take us 6 months. When we get all this thing done, what will we have achieved? That's our criteria. Go to it. City of Toledo, 500,000, what did I say, 2 million people? 500,000. I'm just pulling this out of the air. 500,000 people, and 6 months. All right. At the end of this process, what will we have achieved? State it as a criterion. State that goal in a form you can turn it easily into a criterion or treat it as a criterion. Now, I should tell you at this time, my purpose is not to get the perfect statement, or to keep revising the statements until we get, okay, let's try it. Who's got a statement that's fairly complete now, you're satisfied that it's about as, it makes sense? Let's hear it. And we're just after stuff to work with, we're not after a perfectness. Let's go.
At the conclusion of 6 months, 80% of the evangelical churches in the Toledo area will have present the gospel to 75% of people.
80% of the churches will have presented gospel to 75% of the people. And put another one up here just so you have 2 to work on at a time. Give me another one that's very similar to this, but not quite.
I said after 6 months, 80% of the churches will see a 20% increase in attendance.
80% of churches will experience what next?
I said a 20% increase in attendance.
In attendance?
Yes.
Okay, that's good enough for now. We'll work with those two for a moment. Now, as I say, one of the things I'm trying to do with this exercise is to bring to the surface some things that you wouldn't even focus well unless you try to do this and back off and say, now what have I done? Let's just look at these one at a time. Remember what the task was. We got 500,000 people out there to evangelize across 6 months. All right? That was understood, wasn't it? Now, one of the problems here, of course, is that this word here is an indistinct word. What is it to evangelize? Is it to gain converts, which is what this one sounds like we're pitching toward, or is it to do exposure, which is what this one is pitching toward? So in the first place, just any two that we get first here illustrate a fundamental difference because of the fogginess of that word there. Right. Now then, there's another major difference between these two. What is it? Major difference. Not in the numbers, but in the idea.
One is just present the gospel, the other one is going for results, actual conversion.
I think you're extending the point, but it's a good point. I don't think it follows that these are converted simply because they're attending. But it's much more likely than it would be without that, so it's probably that direction. I tried to highlight it when I laid it up here. Did you see what I highlighted? Without being blunt about it?
Present next year.
Right. See this one? And this one? One is concerned with delivery, and the other is concerned with consequence. That's a very, very common switch we do quite often when we set up an evaluation. See, our motive was not to simply make people aware, unless that's what evangelize means. So you have to come back and say, what does evangelize mean? Is it, have we really evangelized when people have experienced something? Right? But that one is embedded in the deeper problem here that differentiates these two. Now, it's not a question of one is terribly wrong and the other is terribly right. It's just that they're very different in their concept. Notice how the percentages lie. Notice how the percentages modify things. This one is actually 2 criteria. And it would seem to be an example of what you mean by, isn't the 80-2 criteria? It is when you do it this way. This one is 2 criteria now. What's the point?
The churches and the people.
Yeah. You see, this could be set up, say 60% of the church can read 75. There's no relationship between this one and this one. These are both arbitrary, not in relationship to each other. Where this one says 80% of the churches will have this each, respectively. So the 80% reflexes into this. Here, the 75% doesn't reflex into here at all. It's an aggregate. So there are 2 criteria. One is if we don't get 80% of the churches engaged, we've failed. We're falling short. And this one, if we don't get out to 75% of the people in the aggregate, we fail. So that's 2 criteria. Is that reasonably clear? So this is kind of like a modification of the 80-80, but it's a twist on it. It's not a correct use of the 80-80. There's nothing wrong with having 2 criteria. However, when somebody asked me a little while ago, can we have 2 criteria? I said I prefer you not, or in fact I may have said flat out no, because at this point for this exercise it's going to get us too confused if we have too many criteria. But the point here is that you can take this out and simply say the churches will present. Never mind who does how much of it. This will accomplish it. There's nothing inherent in this statement here that talks about church participation. You follow? Our goal was to evangelize 500 all the people of Toledo, right? If I can do it with one church, well, fine, still done. This one says, no, we gotta get a lot of churches involved. That's not said here. It might be a very wholesome thing to do. But this is why you've got to be very, very careful to listen closely and work well with your board of reference, or what sometimes are called stakeholders. And you can use that term if you want to in your proposal to designate these people. What is a stakeholder? These are the people who stakeholders own purposes, objectives, and performance criteria. Got it? Stakeholder. So if you're listening closer to your stakeholders, you may discover that your stakeholders hold this, in fact. The overall thing for the project didn't call for it, but by the time it works through the stakeholders, they've decided that this 80% thing is very significant. Or that your stakeholders may determine that how they are looking at evangelism would equate it with church attendance. And you're the evaluator. You're not there to interpret the encyclopedia. You're not there to interpret the gospel. You're there in the role of an evaluator, and your responsibility is to encourage and nurture and challenge the stakeholders, but not to tell them how to think or what words to use. Does that make sense? That's just one of the restrictions you play when you're playing the role of the evaluator. All right, let's have another one. Somebody else got one that you can throw up here. And human beings, being what they are, feel better about achieving or even not achieving that goal than they would about achieving or not achieving some overly stated goal. Why? Because people don't like to fail. And if you overstate the goal, you raise it too high, you're constantly not succeeding. You know, the United Way campaigns, the raising money for the community chest and all the stuff that they do in communities in America, we set local goals and we set their goal at such and such and we go for it, you know? Then we keep records and put them in the newspapers every couple of days. Here's how we're going on the goal. You know, when those people set those goals, they work that thing out literally with a fine-toothed statistical comb to make sure that they haven't set it too high. But they don't want to come in low. They want to come in over that goal a little bit, so that everybody can go away from that campaign feeling, I thought we did it, we achieved. Now that's the psychological side of evaluation. This is, again, one of the reasons why when you're doing evaluative stuff, you're trying to inform executive decisions, but you're also trying to nurture a socio-psychological community. And if you're not careful, you can use the evaluative activity to create a kind of a downer for everybody. And if you're the guy who hires you once finds you doing that, you don't get hired the second time. And he's not smart enough to tell you that that's part of the bargain. So you get mousetrapped by it. And especially beginners do that. Beginners will set, or urge stakeholders to set very high, very rigorous criteria and then, you know, exhort them to go for it. They don't achieve it, they feel bad about the whole thing. And then who catches it in the neck? The evaluator. Says, well, that was my job. No, but it was your job to make sure that people didn't get themselves into that kind of a bind. Now, did someone start down another trail? Very good, very good. See, I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased because you do have the concept of the criterion. These are all expressing very well that you do have the concept of criterion. And the reason I'm laboring over them one by one is because each one of them has decided something slightly different about how to cope with the various problems that you have confronted in this generalization right here. See, in those few words, those few lines there, I've entered you into a rather ambiguous world, and you've had to sort out that ambiguity somehow. This is the way it works, and this is what criterion raising is all about. But if you don't get it down to the place where you know how you can measure it, you know how you can assess it, know who you will need to ask, you haven't gotten anywhere with your criterion. Your criterion has to get that far, or it won't function as a guidance mechanism for your design. Now, do you see where, if I can say, I know what it is he wants to do here, I know what he wants to do here, I know how many people he's assuming here, I know how many people he has to start with here, I have to do a sample. You see how I got to that? In other words, the criteria steered me into the technique. Just like an experiment, the hypothesis steers you into the technique. You can't do things willy-nilly. You've got to stick with the guidance mechanism. And in this case, it's the criteria. That's a fine example. All right, anybody else got another one?
Can I just go with this for a minute? Seems like this also points you back to the question of pretest.
Oh,
Dealing with
good. Yeah,
20%. How do you know you
I've
didn't
forgotten
already-
all kinds of things here today. Good. Go ahead.
How do you know you didn't have 20% before you started?
Yeah, good. This, remember I said you got to carry a preoccupation with pre-post? The point being that if you have no concept of pre-post worked into this, and no data that you either search out or have pre-discovered, you're going to tend to take anything that happens as against a zero base. So if now I've got 20 people, 20% of the people saying, yes, I made a decision for Christ, you'd have to ask them expressly, did you make that between the dates of so-and-so and so-and-so? Otherwise, I'm tapping into the pre-decided. But you can do it. You can do it. It's just that you have to carry, you get my word, carry that preoccupation along as you design. You've got to deal with that. Either in the questions I ask or in the technique I use to draw the sample. Okay. Another one. These are smacko good. We cover. Right there? Okay.
80% of the 500,000 have heard 80% of the defined core of the gospel within 6 months.
Core of the gospel?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have that more or less right. 80% have heard 80% of the defined core of the gospel?
Within 6 months.
Yeah, that's built into our problem. Okay. How are you going to find that out?
That well, that will be the same as the previous one. You are driven towards the sampling.
Right. It's going to have a similar model as the previous one. And we'll need to just sample and do a telephone survey. And that is doable. Is 500,000 too big to sample from? Any opinions about that? Pardon?
Nielsen does millions.
Well, you know, us Baptists are a little more conservative. No, that should have been classified as a stupid question, by the way. Somebody didn't have the nerve to say it, but that was a stupid question. 500,000, 5 million, whatever it is. The point is that if it gets bigger than about 5,000, you're going to have to sample. Or maybe realistically more than 50 if you're going to do personal interviews. That's the way you handle big numbers. The very fact that you see the big numbers. That's one reason I put this city 500,000 in there. So you'd have to be facing the fact that you're going to have to sample at some point. And when you just do a good evaluative study, when you're talking about a broad impact, we're talking, you see here, about a community impact kind of thing. I deliberately got you started out thinking about this in terms of a mass effect problem. And sampling is going to be part of the design. Now, does that mean it's going to be inherently an experimental study, not a descriptive study? Isn't that a good question? What's your answer?
I'm not designing an experiment.
Or maybe something like somebody else is doing.
I could use an experimental design if I had an appreciable number already out there on an ongoing thing. We're already getting this level. For example, if I were looking at a comparison of the rate at which people are deciding for Christ or joining in churches, and I got a rate during this period of so-and-so, now I'm going to bring in this evangelism effect for 6 months, then I'm going to see if the rate is effective. So I can use rate of church growth, pre-post. Then it would be like an experimental study, and I'd probably use a quantitative experimental design. Okay? But this one here is basically a descriptive design, but it's going to be intensively quantitative, because we're going to be doing interviews that we're going to look at quantitatively.
What makes it particularly evaluated? I mean, what distinguishes this from, you just call it evaluating?
What distinguishes it from an experimental study?
Yeah.
That's what you're asking. And so what is your answer?
Well, you're using criteria.
Oh, stop. That's it. You're working to criteria, not to a hypothesis. Now, your criteria smells an awful lot like. The criteria smells a lot like some of that stuff you were throwing around as experimental hypotheses, because many of your experimental hypotheses were not really very well grounded in anything we might call theoretical literature. So they look a lot like this. So what's the difference? Well, it's not the evaluative that we're cheapening by the process. It's the experimental we're cheapening by the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we're using these words today all together right to refer to this. But an experimental type model would work only if you have something here that you're going to affect to see the change. So the model I've built for you here is we're going to assume kind of a zero base, which is of course never true. That's why you have to have a pre-post in mind. But we're just going to say we're going to bring this thing in here and explode it, and then count bodies. That's literally the model we're using. It's called the bomb drop model. Okay? Anybody else have one you're aching to share with us? Got some nuance in it? Or something that you're definitely afraid might be exposed? Because otherwise I'm going to move you to another one. All right? Now you're going to go from a mission example or from an evangelism example. You're going to go to another one. This time, we're going to go to 25 students. And they are enrolled in a intercultural skills course. Intercultural skills workshop. Okay, now that's as far as I took you the other time. I won't take you this far again. In order to do what? What do you think the real outcome ought to be here? Just tell me about that first before you start getting criteria. I'm going to make these adult students too, just to make it a little bit more clear. 25 adult students in the intercultural skills workshop. Let's put a length on it of 40 hours over 8 days. 40 hours over 8 days. What do you think they might get out of that? What would you hope they would get out of that? These people are all going to be intercultural educators or intercultural missionaries. They're going to work interculturally, and you're trying to get them ready. What would be your hope for the change that this course would produce, this workshop?
Sensitivity to other cultures.
To result in, Donna, help me.
Increased sensitivity to.
It was that word increased I was waiting for. Increased sensitivity. Sensitivity to
Other cultures. People of other cultures.
let's do that. I think we'll be able to say that. people of another culture. Is that too much liberty with your idea? All right. Give me another one. Desirable outcome from an educational or a learning standpoint. A desirable outcome.
Understand the importance of relationships.
That's an awful lot like this one. Try to go with a little bit different twist on it. Can we?
Decrease the amount of intercultural conflict in the dormitories. Increase.
Decrease, to decrease. I want you to know this one's going bad, this is mine. Yeah. The frequency of
intercultural conflict. Well, they're adult students.
well, they're in this workshop in dormitory situations with people from other cultures. We just decided that. All right. Now, what we've got here is one thing that is conceptual, functional. The other one is a great deal more observable, tangible, which is what I was trying to get at here. Okay, now, give me some criteria. Or give me appropriate criterion statement or statements that will allow us to evaluate in this case. Try to write them out. You did so well the first round, let's do it again. How many of you did it in one criterion? 2 of you? 3 of you? How many did it in 2? 3? Yeah, each going higher than 3. 4? Where are the rest of you? Your hands up. How many of you did it with no criteria at all? That's a new way to go. New way to go. All right. Let's get one of them up here. Keep writing if you're still working, but listen with one ear and write with the other ear. Yes, sir.
I tried after 20 hours,
Yep.
15 students will begin to appreciate people from other cultures.
15 will begin to understand
Yeah, understand.
people from other cultures. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Now, is that 1 or is that 2? Is that the whole thing?
That's the whole.
That's the whole thing. All right, let's get one more person's up here. Like we did before, we'll get 2 of them up here and then we'll get them in pairs.
80% of students will self-report increased sensitivity and decreased conflict in 50% of their interactions.
80% will report increased, what? Sensitivity.
And decreased conflict.
Is that it?
In 50% of their interactions.
In 50%, okay? In 50% of their interactions.
With people or, the rest of it.
As a vote, okay. All right, now, interesting, you referred to that as one criterion,
Mhm.
and you referred to this as one criterion. Obviously, at least 50% of you people are wrong. Okay. The first one, is it a single criterion? 15 will begin to understand people from other cultures. Anybody want to argue that that's more than one criterion? I think not. Now, in the second case, is it one criterion? You're shaking your head negatively because you're just always against everything, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. So this time, what do you think?
It's two.
You think it's two, all right? All right. What do you think they are?
Increased sensitivity, the decreased conflict.
Yeah. Especially when they go in opposite direction, it really is cheating to call that one criterion. You see, here's the point. If it were one criterion, we're going to need one procedure to analyze it. We can't analyze that one in one procedure. Because in the first place, the same data won't serve for increased sensitivity and decreased conflict.
I guess my question is then, if the procedure were an interview,
Yeah.
wouldn't you have many items on your questionnaire or many questions you were asking the interviewer that would get at various things?
Sure.
But they need to be stated with different sentences?
Has nothing to do with it.
Okay.
Your criteria are matters that you're going to be separately examining. You have a potential of meeting or not meeting independently. See, there's no fundamental interlock there. You're just using the same criteria, same numerical proportions over this positive change and this negative change. But the data you would need to get to determine if this has happened or not, and the data you would need to get would be different. They could come from the same interview, they could come from the same questionnaire, but they're not the same items. In other words, it's from a different source. Now, what he's going to get here is going to basically be pretty singular, and that's why it is one criterion. Now, sometimes several pieces of data fit into the answering of a criterion. You're dead right. But that's why I say, especially when you see one going one direction, the other going the other direction, and nothing in the statement interlocks them, then clearly it'd be a lot easier to manipulate this whole study if we separated them and treated them as two criteria. There's nothing to gain by combining them. There's another way to put it. There's no merit in having fewer criteria. If indeed you want to get at both of those and can in the same framework, for heaven's sakes, do it. And in fact, it's really called for over here. It's really called for. See, this is really a demand for two criteria.
And two criteria are two different statements,
That's right.
complete statements.
Or can be best presented as two totally independent statements. You don't gain power by comma this, comma that, and so, especially if you're going to get separate answers to them. That's a very important notion. And when this is another place where I changed it. You know, the first time we had a different one, now we got this one. It's changed in various ways, and one of the ways it's changed is that this really does call for two criteria, call for the spelling out of two criteria. See, this is what, if you please, this is what the boss told you we really got to look into. And after you work with your committee, and after you work with the people that are going to be the real owners of the criteria, you come up with your criterion statement. It's got to still have some conformity to this, and the fact is that this one already set you off in some pretty good directions. Because this is essentially not a behavioral observation kind of thing, and this one particularly is. Yours could be tested in both cases. Because the decreased conflict is not spelled out. What is conflict? Is this actualized conflict, or is this conflictive reasoning? That's, by the way, one of the problems with both of these is that the thing you would be testing for or examining for or observing for, the criterion behavior, is not all that well defined. Increased sensitivity. could be demonstrated, could be observed for. But it'd probably be much more easily tested for. There are some pretty fair instruments that would allow their use for this kind of thing. But for the conflict, especially if you were looking at this kind of a concern here, something actually, this one, in the dormitory, so that really calls for an observational kind of thing, or some kind of a reportage from someone. Are you perturbed? Does it worry you that I'm arguing for two criteria? No. Okay. Your face didn't quite tell me that you were comfortable. You are as tired looking as I am. The two of us, I think, are going to get the medal this afternoon for survival if we make it by 10:05. Okay. All right. Now, what about this first one up here? 15 will begin to understand people from other cultures. Can you do this?
What does that mean?
I'll tell you why you shouldn't. If you haven't thought of it. You can, yes. Nothing technically wrong with it, but it creates an awkward problem. What if you could only get a hold of 14 of them? I said there were 25, but I don't know that I can get a hold of all 25 and get the data from all 25. The minute you make this non-proportion, by making it a hard number, you set up a whole different parameter, a whole different requirement in the study. That's one reason why we use percentage of the population, a percentage of the group. But in a class, coming up with a number like that is not necessarily a bad thing. However, if I were dealing with 25 students in a class, I would not settle for a number that low. I would insist on more than that, beginning, for heaven's sake. I mean, what kind of a teacher are you? Or do you have? You're the evaluator, you're not the teacher, but you must have some pretty incompetent people if after 40 hours, only 15 are beginning. It suggests either very, very poor teaching or very, very poor approach to the topic. And one of the things you have to be very cautious about is that you don't allow a curriculum or a criterion setting panel or group to pull the criterion down so low that everybody's going to feel like a great victory if just a little bit better than nothing is happening. You know, we got 500 people in this course, and Joe Smith passed. You know, that gets a little bit, you know. And if the criterion were set 1 out of 500 passes, it sounds a little like medical school. And that's not necessarily the best kind of education. But the bigger problem here is right here. How do we assess beginning to understand? So in other words, you got to watch it because your criterion setting can work you into an unworkable study. You follow me? So if you're not really careful, you can write yourself into a trap. And then I'm going to say, anybody would say to you, whoa, how are you going to measure that? I said, well, it's going to be hard, but we'll do it somehow. Come on, how are you going to do it? Don't be foggy about it. Be clear about it. You say, well, that's probably not the best choice of criteria. Exactly. Work back through it and say, how could we get a closer to reality criterion that could be better assessed?
Do you use test instruments as frequently in evaluative research as you use interviews?
Surely.
Okay, so you can use a reliable and valid questionnaire measure or something.
Yeah, you can even make questionnaires. A lot of them.
But
much evaluation is done on the telephone. Telephone interviews. Today, telephone interviews are the main instrumentation for evaluative studies.
But you can pre-test that interview for reliability and validity before you use it?
Oh, sure. If you're going to treat the items as objective, but ordinarily what you do is just refine it. I'll tell you what let me explain to you the procedure I used in a study recently. I did a study of 105 presidents of Bible colleges in the U.S. and Canada. Literally a population of the whole of the member presidents of the American Association of Bible Colleges. Interviewed each one of them in an interview that was worked out to a time between 20 and 30 minutes. A few of the interviews took longer. They were because I got into some people who just wanted to talk. And I let it run as long as 40 minutes before I snipped it. But they were timed for 20 to 30 minutes. I called each one of them in blocks, each 2 or 3 days. I worked half days on this for about 3.5 weeks, just mornings. And I would call a block like on Monday, I would call 15 names. And I would ask them when during the week, and I had a chart, when would be most convenient. I've got this time open, this time open, this time open. I need 30 minutes for this interview. They all knew it was coming because it was sponsored by their association. Okay, fine, very cooperative, had to be. And so then I called them back on appointment. And actually I used another little trick. I had them call me because I reminded them the association was paying my phone bills, and they were all motivated to keep the institution or the association costs down on this study. So I said, you just call me on your number. It'd be a lot cheaper than me calling you. They didn't work through the rationale of that argument, but nevertheless it worked. And they would call me at a certain time, which, by the way, is a great thing when you're interviewing. Because when you're interviewing and you're on your line, somebody has run overtime. The other guy calls you back in again on the appointed time, and lines it if he knows why. But if you're still talking on one interview and the next guy calls in, I mean, you're supposed to call out. You can't get off the line to call out. So he sits there wondering what's happening. So it works a lot better if you can work around people to call you in, but that doesn't happen too often. So anyway, I would then call them on the schedule until I'd worked through that block of names. When I called them, I would tell them that the interview, I demonstrated to you the technique of the telephone interview. And I explained that I wasn't going to record them, but I was going to record me, and they would hear back everything that went down. Everything's going to go into the typewriter. You will hear it. Because the only thing we're going to type up is what I'm saying back to you. Okay, so then what I did was to go through the protocol of questions and come back to them with the questions, and then back to them with their responses to the questions, and interact around that stuff a little bit, and then come back to them what else they were saying. And then at that point, we would go on into the, tell you the truth, I just lost it right now. I lost my point. What was I going for?
Refining, how you're going to refine the question.
Ah, yes, thank you. That's another product of old age. I've done that since I was 30. Dropping the chain of thought. Yeah, the interview outline that I had set up at first, I had practiced it over with just 3 people who were not members of this group, okay? That I just walked it through with 3 other presidents of non-related institutions. And I did a little bit of refining there, and I asked them, what else along this line would be important to get at. Got some suggestions. Then, in each case, what I did was to listen, and listen, and listen, and listen. And then notice what questions that I was asking that didn't get anything new. They just got the same kind of information in a little different package. And then I'd mark that out. And then I'd see where somebody wanted to say something that I hadn't asked for. And I'd say, that's an angle. So for about the first 20 interviews, part of my problem was to take a fresh protocol sheet for each one of them and add to the protocol sheet things or strike out to modify the protocol to fit what they were really wanting to talk about. So I modified only up through 20. That's the first 5th, really, of the subjects. And then in each subsequent interview, I would do everything that I had modified. So I never stuck with the original more than just one shot. I learned something there, change it. Learned something, change it. And then after 20, they froze. And I didn't change it. You'd be surprised how you can tell in a certain amount of experience. You can tell when you're getting to a point of redundancy with an interview. You're just not getting new data. And why bother? If you got items down there and say, well, I got to go through these other items, but I know I'm not going to get anything. It's kind of dumb. So you just modify the thing until you come down to what you do want, you do need, and can get. And you just modify on the hoof. And that's actually the real world. And in the evaluative study, that is enough, because you're not doing the scientific kind of thing when you're assessing validity or reliability per se of your items. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's more than you needed to know.
No, I thought for that.
Anyhow, we're out of time. And if I dragged you guys on any extra time tonight, I would feel like an absolute tyrant. You people look so deathly tired. I can't imagine what it is you're doing this term that wears you out. My wife told me, she said, a student wife came over to the clothes horse, Margaret Horse clothes horse this morning, and she overheard her saying something to Marietta, one of our faculty wives, who also works at Margaret. She overheard this conversation, and the student was saying, "Oh, we've had a really rough week." Marietta, all innocence, said, "Well, why? What's going on?" She said, "Oh, my husband is involved in a very difficult course. It takes so much time." And the student wife is going on and on and on about turmoil and torture. And Margaret said, "I couldn't resist." I said, "Is that by any chance 921? It was. So anyway, Margaret told me to apologize in house.